Yes, please.
This is something I'm sure you can come up with exceptions to the rule, but it seems like so often the Middle East, North Africa, those countries, you're talking about a lack of democracy as far as, well, yes, there's a legislative branch in Saudi Arabia, but they serve at the pleasure of the king. Why has that area of the world never seemed to have prospered as far as having a democratically elected government? Are they so, I wanted to say, I mean, to us, that would seem like a worthy goal. Apparently, why is that not?
Well, most areas in the world haven't really had democratic government or long experience with that. I mean, first of all, could you say that China really ever had a parliamentary system? I mean, if you tried to point to the nationalist period, Chiang Kai-shek was a sort of a mafioso type dictator. He was terrible. And then obviously the communist regime hasn't had anything we would recognize as democracy. So since the period before Chiang Kai-shek was civil war, and then before that Manchu Empire, that's not had it either. And that's a very substantial part of the world and its population. And if you said Latin America, well, yes, but Latin America is part of the Western tradition, more or less. And of course, it's also not always been honored, democracy there, but at least you could say it's been sometimes honored. And the Middle Eastern countries, first of all, there are more practical democratic aspects in the countries there than often meets the eye. Now, except Saudi Arabia, which you mentioned, actually, although you kind of called that a parliament at the pleasure of the king, and I may have said something like that, but it's really the consultative council. Really, it has no legislative power at all. I mean, there's simply no parliamentary regime in Saudi Arabia and never has been. So that would exactly fit what you're saying in that particular case. But other countries are quite other than that. The Iranian parliament, since the revolution, has been a very lively place. And that has been, full of opposition against the government, although that doesn't get filtered over here. And Iran doesn't have a dictator because there isn't any single dictatorial figure there in that country. Of course, it was also true that at one point, as far as women went, that for a period of 2 years, Tansu Çiller was the prime minister of Turkey, and Benazir Bhutto was the prime minister of Pakistan, and Khalid was the prime minister of Bangladesh, collectively ruling 1/4 of the Muslims under them, and they were 3 women. And they only got to their positions in each case through an electoral process. And that electoral process has gone with fits and starts in various places, so that there are military coups that come back and so forth. And then sometimes the governments are less democratic than they appear on the surface, although they veer this way and that way somewhat. Like in Egypt, for example, there was a parliamentary democracy during, well, it was never really quite a full one, but it was pretty lively for part of its time, especially from the years 1933 to 1952, under the British protectorate, in effect, and the kings. And then after that, it's been a fairly dictatorial and military regime, although it's frequently had elections and, it has had intermittently a certain amount of press freedom. In fact, the Egyptians' press freedom is something like that is typical of many of the countries, is that the ruler cannot be criticized in the press, the high ruler, but everybody else can be. Even the ministers in the government and so on can be criticized. And so that certainly gives you an opening to criticize the government. And Morocco has quite a fairly liberal system. It is rather more parliamentary than before, and especially the new king has said that he means to be like Juan Carlos of Spain. That is, to just be a constitutional monarch with not any effect on the day-to-day running of the state. Jordan has had very free elections, although the Muslim parties boycotted the last elections there, but it has had what has been recognized as a more liberal type of parliamentary regime. And then you have other things like the eradicators in Algeria are dictatorial. Tunisia is dictatorial in much the same sense as Egypt. in that it has some window dressing but not any real democracy. And Libya has been a rather dictatorial state, and so on. So some of them have had, more of that kind of history, but it's not completely without democratic side also. So.
Yeah, I realize the exceptions. This seemed like more times than not to me. You look north of the Mediterranean, you look south of the Mediterranean.
Yeah, north of the Mediterranean is Europe, and that has gone through a completely different history. And if you look outside of Europe on the whole, for the most places, you don't see it as being completely democratic. And if you looked at India, which is sometimes called the world's largest democracy, which, although it has obviously dominated by Hindus and Hinduism, this is 82% of the people there, but the population is also at least 11 or 12% Muslim. And they do vote in the elections too, especially they go out and vote against the Hindu nationalist parties that want to hurt their interests. And yet that has certain limitations on it as well, because the government has often dissolved state governments and ruled by decree, and you wouldn't find that the case here. So you wouldn't say that would be either quite a democracy on the American lines. Not quite, although still it's, you can argue that it's been a fairly good thing as well. Anything else? Usually I wait with my students, and because sometimes waiting helps. But of course, if you want to go and get ready to go to Santa Fe, then that's another matter. All right. Thank you.